Hi, fellow geochemists and geochemistry enthusiasts. Welcome to Geochemist Tea, the only podcast for people who love geochemistry with a side of tea. Our mission is to inspire aspiring geochemists and to introduce our listeners to niche geochemistry topics. I'm your host, Sam Schur, and this month we're talking with Alan Koenig about inappropriateness around microanalytical techniques. Alan Koenig is the technical advisor for analytical metallurgical services at Newmont. Alan, welcome to Geochemistry.
Thanks, Sam, for having me. It's great to be here. I'm honored to be a member of this community that's given so many great podcasts to your show. I really appreciate what you do.
Oh, I really appreciate that. Thank you. So getting back to you, though, but I love talking about myself.
Sure.
My friends all know this. Anyway, so Alan has over 25 years of experience in both the private and public sector, focusing on analytical instrumentation, where he has garnered a lot of opinions about their applications to geochemical issues. Alan, as a self-proclaimed chief technology wizard, I wouldn't dream of denying our listeners your journey into geochemistry. So could you tell us your experience and perhaps sprinkle some advice in there for our young listeners who are itching to get into geochemistry?
Certainly. And my friends know that I certainly love to talk about my history and where I've come from in terms of this journey that we're all on as careers, as scientists. My careers, as you mentioned, Sam, both private and public sector, I've bounced around between instrument companies and also a long stint at the US Geological Survey. But before we get to the actual career stuff. I think the actual what the heck I wanted to do when I grew up is probably a big part of my journey. For me, college was a unknown first generation college student. So growing up in Jersey, I knew nothing about rocks. I knew nothing about the West, and
I'm
I'd
from
never
New
been.
York.
Yeah,
We're kind
actually,
of,
yeah,
yeah.
I think I heard that on one of your shows. I grew up in North Jersey, had never been east of or west of Eastern Pennsylvania, so never outside that Jersey area. Never really gotten to see much. So I went to college actually in Colorado. It was the furthest, cheapest I could find from New Jersey, and fell in love with the outdoors and the mountains. Ironically, I started out as a chemistry major. That seemed like fun, and I switched to geology because I thought that I didn't want to be stuck in a lab. And I've spent my whole career stuck in a lab, which is actually where I actually am best. So I've oscillated throughout my whole career between that chemistry and the geology part, and I think that's actually what makes this whole world of geochemistry kind of fun. Is it certainly has multiple hats that can and should be worn. Yeah, after a little bit of a detour, I actually dropped out of college. Couldn't afford to go back. Went back to Jersey and taught astronomy for a couple of years at the Newark Museum. Worked at the planetarium there, and went back to Colorado to actually get serious about school. Went to grad school at CSU in Colorado State in Fort Collins. And my journey with regards to the advice for the next generation is knock on random doors, create those opportunities for yourself. When I was looking for a work study job, I just went randomly knocking on one of the doors at CSU. That's actually where I finished my undergrad. So when I started there, I just went knocking on a door, happened to be the rhenium osmium geochemistry lab in the department there, and said, hey, I like chemistry, I like lab stuff, can I help out? And so my first job there in the lab was, of course, washing dishes in this isotope geochemistry lab. And that's how we get our start. But that was really a great opportunity for me to combine my love of instrumentation and just the science in general. While I was chemistry undergrad, I actually had the opportunity to do a undergrad research with an organic chemist. His two favorite tools were the hacksaw and the hammer. And I got to learn that instruments are actually not always meant to be followed the instruction manual, and you can actually take them apart and make them sometimes do things they weren't intended to do. So that was part of my upbringing on the instrument side. with just tinkering with instruments. So yeah, I guess I describe myself as a metamorphic petrologist or an ex-metamorphic petrologist, since I don't do that much anymore these days. But my whole graduate project actually started out as an undergraduate research project looking at garnets, looking at what happens when you dissolve these minerals and you assume that what you dissolve is a homogeneous mixtures of a monomineralic substance, and that's never the case. So when we do isotope geochemistry on bulk stuff, we assume that the signature we get is from the thing that we're hoping the story is coming from. When garnet's a rock, it always has micro-inclusions. So anything that has multiple minerals is a rock. Most minerals are rocks, and we get that really confused. We'll talk about that a lot more throughout this rant. But
Wait,
so minerals are mostly rocks, and we forget that. And what happens when you dissolve this garnet and it has other minerals in it that muck up your story, muck up your isotope geochemistry. And a lot of my career has been about what happens with those little inclusions that are hiding in your rock, in your mineral that you think you're studying. And we, of course, in the mineral industry, we talk about the nugget effect, but we understand the nugget effect when we talk about gold. But somehow we forget about that nugget effect when it's not gold related and those other inclusions are there, those other chemical stories are there, just waiting to be interpreted, or muck up your answer if you're not paying attention. So yeah, so I did a whole thing on isotope geochemistry, particularly geochronology, for garnet, without ever getting to any geochronology, because I started asking silly questions like, what do we know about the residence of these elements, these isotopes in the garnet, before we actually smash it and dissolve it and assume it was homogeneous? And that's where I landed on Denver. USGS had one of these newfangled techniques called laser ablation ICP-MS. I just knocked on the door and said, hey, I'm doing this project on garnet. Can I come down and shoot stuff with your laser? And fortunately, they were open to that. So they're like, yeah, sure. And really, it was the start of a long journey that has centered really around microanalytical techniques, trace element chemistry, mineral chemistry as a whole. But yeah, I did some laser ablation on these garnets, showed that the story wasn't as straightforward as the bulk isotope geochemists thought it would be. And that's really what my graduate work was on, was showing that, hey, we should actually look at these things analytically before we actually dissolve them. And that's actually spawned a whole series of garnet geochronologists that now have bought lasers or ultimately ended up coming to my lab and doing a lot of garnet work before we spend time doing isotope work. So that's the journey from the career and academic standpoint. I was actually trying to figure out what I wanted to do post grad school, and just went and again knocked on that door down at the USGS. They had a position down there that was probably like a rock crushing job. I really can't remember, but I went down and interviewed for a position just because it was something in the area. My fiance, no, wife, had already gotten a job for the Colorado Geological Survey, and we wanted to stay in the area. So I went down to Denver and interviewed for a rock crushing job. And while I was there, I popped over to the laser ablation lab and visited Ian, who ran the lab, who let me use the lab for my graduate work, and just said, hey, I'm in the area. I just thought I'd stop by. And he's, funny you stopped by. That's how I ended up actually working at the USGS. So initially took a position just being the lab operator for laser ablation at the US Geological Survey in the minerals program. And I was doing some cool stuff with the laser at the time. Back up a little bit. One of the things that happened during my graduate work was they would let me come down and use the laser lab. And I had decided that I wanted to actually, instead of just making one of these boring tables of data or spot maps, maybe a line scan across the grain, we had said, geez, these particular garnets look like they're so interestingly zoned. Wouldn't it be cool to have a trace element map just like we do with the microprobe? And so I talked with Ian about it, and he's, no, you can't do that. That's crazy. The instrument doesn't let you do that. It's going to be a big pain in the butt. And fortunately, he trusted me to run the instrument on my own. So he set me up in the morning, and I went ahead and actually ignored his instructions and made the first ever trace element map of a 1 centimeter garnet. And so this was during my grad project. We made the first ever quantitative trace element map by laser ablation, and that sort of became a cornerstone of my thesis. Of course, made the first pretty pictures of garnets for trace elements for rare earth zoning in these garnets. And it was painful to do. I sat there and literally manually pushed the go button for about 1,200 analyses, one at a time. It was horrible viewing optics. It was no automation. It was all run in a manual fashion. But Ian tells the story. He really appreciated that I was able to trick it into doing something and showed the inclination to not follow his instructions. And so he was happy to hire me after that. I did work at the USGS for about 2 years. And because of my inclination to tinker with the instruments and do things with it that it wasn't intended to do, the company that made the instrument actually hired me to be global product manager for laser ablation products. So my wife and I were young and foolish, so we moved to Omaha for a couple of years, and I got to really work with the global community. This was at the time when laser ablation was just taking off. We were really just starting to understand how it really worked, and I got to work with some of the leading labs in the world, particularly the lab in Zurich with the Detlef Gunter group. And so I actually funded a project through the instrument company, a development of new instrumentation. Got to spend time in the lab in Zurich. Amazing opportunity here for me just to come along on this journey. To end up doing some of that was really super cool. And so yeah, then I got tired of the instrument business, tired of corporate world, went back to the USGS and worked there for 15 years, running laser ablation lab, running some of the other analytical labs, and really doing a whole bunch of varied things, which I'll come back to at some point later on. We'll talk about cool things you can do with laser ablation. But 15 years of the USGS, laser ablation, bulk chemistry, microanalytical chemistry. Got an opportunity to leave the safety net of the federal government. This was 2019, actually. Had an opportunity to go to another instrument company and work on application and instrument development. So we left the safety of the federal government. We moved from Denver to California, uprooted my kids in middle school and high school. And we had done all the risk analysis of like changing jobs, uprooting the kids. The one thing we didn't account for was that little global pandemic thing. And that put a wrench in the plans. That was definitely tough for small instrument companies. So I became unemployed and did the whole consulting thing for a little while. Of course, you know how tough that is, and didn't want to move the kids again since we uprooted them. I consulted in California for a little bit, and then an opportunity came available to be the analytical lab manager here at Newmont back in Denver. And of course, being from Denver for a long time, it was a great opportunity. It was rough on the family. We're still dealing with some of the challenges of moving high school students and now college students. But fortunately, both my kids have actually decided to come to school in Colorado, and we're really happy we're back to home here in Denver. What a circle it's been.
Listening to your story, I've heard a few keywords in it, and don't think I didn't listen to other things, but I just feel like everybody that's young needs to understand these few things, especially because we have quite a large audience that is not from the US. So I heard Newark, I heard Omaha, and then I heard rock crushing and just a lab operator after you had done all that really incredible stuff. So for those that don't know, Newark in New Jersey is considered the armpit of America, and then
Absolutely.
Omaha is in the middle of a cornfield in Nebraska. My point in pointing these out is just that you had already done pretty advanced stuff. You had gotten a degree, you had gotten 2 degrees, you had a stable job, and you uprooted the family to Omaha. And then also your first job after having a grad degree, you went to apply for a rock crushing job en route to maybe something greater, which was operating a lab. I just think what is important to point out here is that you had and have had since then such an amazing career that like it's important that people don't think that you're going to get the most amazing job right out of school and you might have to wait a few years. And really for you, it was only a few years in between each of these in such a long career having worked here in this industry. And I just think that they're just really key things for people to realize that for some people it might happen very quickly, but you also had some of those, and I can't think of the word right now, but you had some of these kind of moments where things like key things happened at the right time, serendipity, but you also had Newark and Omaha. I just think it's just a really powerful story for people to hear that now you've worked at the USGS for so long, you've worked now at Newmont for so long, you did some consulting. At the end of the day, you had some, I would argue, difficult years there in Newark and in Omaha.
Sure, yeah. And this is a really important point. It touches on there's the science side and then there's the human side. And I think that the human side, the life circumstances, things beyond your science plan really factor into this. And maybe sometimes crazy thought, put work-life balance in front of work. And so some of those decisions may be actually encouraged by family decisions and other things like that. It's also part of a journey. I think it would have been very easy for me to be safe and not take that risk. Leaving the USGS, I could have
Mm.
certainly stayed at the USGS the rest of my career. We balanced the opportunity, the challenges. I certainly enjoy the work that I've done and very proud of the work that the USGS does. But maybe it wasn't enough intellectually. It wasn't challenging enough. Maybe it was getting a little boring. And I've always felt like I got to balance those risks. And certainly it was a risk, and it added some extra bumps in the road, some of which we're definitely still paying for, but it certainly brought me to here, and I'm happy for those decisions. Yes, rock crushing, something that's really important from a hiring standpoint. We talk about this here at Newmont, regardless of your position, chemist, metallurgist, mineralogist, environmental scientist, we still have to crush rocks. That's the reality. It's not just at the beginning of your career. Having a respect for the work that goes in, a common theme that will probably come out of this, I hope, at the end, is sample prep, and sampling is many times more important than the instrument. We tend to lose sight of that. So we focus on these fancy magic black boxes, and I get in trouble for saying poop in and poop out. But really, if your sample prep is no good, if you don't respect the rock crushing and the sample preparation, there's no point in having the fancy instruments. And so that's a really important theme. Those that are fortunate or spoiled enough to never have to do the pain of crushing rocks really are at risk for disrespecting the stuff that comes before the instrument work.
I think that's really well said. And thank you so much for this. Right now, it's time for tea time, and
Yes.
the kettle is very hot. So let's hear what you got.
Geez, there's a lot of pressure for tea. You have had some really. I've struggled with this. Just to let the audience know, Sam and I have struggled with how to narrow down topics for this talk in general. But when it comes to the tea, that's an area where I actually struggled with what I was going to say. Yeah, I've been involved in a whole wide variety of topics as a metamorphic petrologist, to be able to have the honor of working on analyzing prostate tissue samples. My garnet mapping techniques have translated into mapping fish ear bones and biological tissue and all sorts of really impactful things. Not to say that garnet isn't impactful or some of the mineral stuff isn't impactful, but prostate cancer, this affects a big fraction of society. And so these are some really important things. So I think that that was one of the things that I wanted to rant about from a T standpoint is I think
Love a
we
good
don't
rant.
we don't really, there's no way to really let people know as they're coming up through the ranks that there's so much more out there. One of the things that I wanted to touch on with regards to this is it's okay to not know where you're going, and it's certainly okay to not know, to know that you're not going to know everything. And this is something, actually, a little personal story. My son is just graduating high school right now, and going off to college. Got to interview with a physics professor. He's decided he wants to be a physicist, and so he's talking to this crazy physicist, wonderful physicist, who spent about an hour and a half with this kid off the street who just wants to come to the school. And one of the important things that he said during that little interview was, at the end of your degree, you're really going to not know a whole lot of physics, because physics is hard, and that's okay. And I was like, damn, that's really cool to tell the undergrads that this is just the beginning of the journey, and we're going to not know a whole lot of things. We're going to certainly learn a lot along the way, but we're going to learn that there's a lot more to learn. And I think that as a community, we don't give that enough respect. We naively think that, oh, I'm going to go to work for this instrument company, or I'm going to send my samples to this contract lab. We naively think that they actually know what the heck they're doing. And I think we need to be more mindful, more acknowledging of the fact that it's like the practice of medicine. It's called the practice of medicine because we don't know everything. And science is a journey. Certainly in the analytical geochemistry community, it's not always right, even though the brochure makes it sound out to be the perfect technique or that. So giving credit to, it's okay to not know things. Maybe this touches on a human component thing. Maybe it touches on a mental health thing. It's okay to give yourself a break for not knowing something or not being able to get something done. And I think as a community, we need to pay more respect to it's okay to not know. It's certainly okay to know that we're going to have to learn a lot along the way. And that's the journey of life that maybe that counts as tea. I'm not really sure.
I think it counts as tea because tea could be a funny story. It could be a rant. It could be really anything that's a little bit gossipy. I think for me, I really hear what you're putting out there. I worked for a vendor too for a while. And I think for me, a lot of the most powerful things I could do for a client was to say to them, I don't know, but let me get back to you. Because
Yes.
I worked with a lot of people that not necessarily that they were a lot smarter than me, but they just had a lot more experience in a very niche field that I did not in. And if I could pull in an expert to find the answers to set questions, much better than me trying to muck through something and really not giving somebody an answer that really was relatively meaningful and maybe would also have them feel like they couldn't trust the company. Yeah, I
That's a
think it's a great point.
really important point, especially having spent time on the vendor side as well. Of course, the bottom line for the vendor is to sell instruments or sell services. And so to say you as a company don't know something, that sounds like a bad thing. But certainly in this community of science dorks that we are, it's going to catch up with you if you say something that's incorrect. You answer the question with false information instead of saying, I don't know. So the long-term value of gaining the respect of the scientific community by saying, I don't know, I think that's a really important lesson and something that I struggled with. Again, kid off the street goes to work for a vendor thinking that these vendors actually knew their own product. That was an interesting lesson for me because they're winging it just like the rest of us. Not that they don't know it, they know it better than probably most people, but there's still a whole lot of uncertainty and there's things that they don't understand. And if we get asked a good question by the scientists, to make stuff up is going to be more damaging in the long term. So I don't know is not a bad thing. And that's something that I think we need to put on a t-shirt and definitely stand on our soapboxes more about.
Yeah, and I think, and this is probably talking to probably people that are not even just starting out. I think at any points in your career, you're going to always encounter somebody that's had many different experiences than you, and it's going to ask different questions that you've never heard before. And it just lends to these, if anything, don't feel embarrassed about it. It lends to these really interesting discussions where you can really learn a lot because they'll either provide you with some background and context, they might not, but then it really expands your knowledge of perhaps a new field or the same field that you're in because now you have to do the work of going to look it up, going to find other people to help you answer these questions. And yeah, my knowledge of different fields has only been expanded by the questions that I have been asked.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a good question. The phrase "that's a good question" is really rewarding because we're moving in the right direction. One of the things that I talk a lot about is I love the fact that as geologists that we're forensic scientists. We're piecing together evidence that's just maybe millions or billions of years old, but we're really answering those questions. We're looking at the evidence and piecing together a story. And I think that's really a fun theme. I've seen students who I taught in mineralogy go on to successful careers in forensic science. And that wasn't field at the time that the geology professors would tell you that you're applicable to go into forensic sciences. We weren't making those connections that as geologists we're really detectives and those questions that we don't know the answer to, that's the next topic to be discovered or expanded on. I think that's really important, and I get really passionate about the topic of science and critical thinking. Certainly in society, science is sometimes viewed as a bad thing, and people are scared of science or scared of scientists, which maybe sometimes is understandable. We're pretty weird sometimes, but without that ability to communicate our science, without that ability to understand the human side, the society side of things, it really is important. We're seeing this every day now in the ability to reflect science into the public in a manner that's understandable, not scary. And I think these are areas that we're seeing some change in science communication. I'm encouraged by a lot of the young science communicators that are really putting science in a more understandable context for the public. I think that's really moving forward in a better direction than when I started this crazy career.
Look, I loved this tea. I think that it was perfect. Yeah, tea can be really soapboxy, and I appreciate a good soapbox.
Right
We've
on.
had a few other soapboxy ones, and
Yeah.
yeah, they can be quite fun. So, look, like you said earlier, for this episode, it was really difficult to settle on a particular publication to get either myself or our listeners up to speed because it's bare out there for what ultimately we wanted to talk about. Although I think if you have your Garnet paper, people would love to see the original picture of a ICP-MS trace map.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I will say that you shared a very lengthy email with me and also a talk that you gave with Ian Ridley at the Geological Society of America in 2016 for a workshop entitled Laser Ablation ICP-MS, an overview of the technique and a look at new advances in quantitative microanalyses for geological, biological, and environmental applications. So, Alan, while we don't want you to go through all of these in detail, could you give us some key highlights of these materials and namely what you would like to go on, maybe a little bit of a rant, but also some science of microanalytical and bulk chemistry techniques?
Yeah, certainly. Understanding how techniques work is something that I think that we maybe because as geologists, we already have too much to learn about on the geology side. We don't spend enough time actually learning how instruments work. And one of the areas that we're at risk for is accepting these new techniques as actually working and without understanding how they operate. So for most of my career, I've been teaching some short courses about how laser ablation actually works. And I was fortunate enough to be raised around in the scientific community around some fundamentals studies of how laser ablation works. And so while I don't think I need everybody who uses a laser ablation system to really understand the physics and chemistry and laser light interaction with solids and all of that stuff. But understanding that there is some things going on there that we at least need to respect. And so that was the theme of these series of short courses that for many years, Ian and I taught this short course together. At the GSA, at Geological Society of America, talking about how we're going to use this laser ablation technique for biological stuff was also important because many of our colleagues are going to end up running a lab at a university and they're going to be asked to analyze geological stuff because that's where laser ablation still has a pretty strong root. But as we've seen today, a growing area of laser ablation is actually being used in the biological sciences. Even 15 years ago, we were teaching about, hey, this tissue mapping stuff is going to be big. And today we see that's actually the case. We're seeing a lot more of laser ablation being used for tissue mapping. The parallels between the challenges of lasering garnets or lasering drug trial monkey teeth or dinosaur bones and prostate tissue, some of the challenges are very similar in terms of how the instruments work. And I think that understanding how these techniques compare to other techniques, I talk about instrumental myopia, where when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The only tool you have is a laser ablation system, laser ablation ICP-MS system. You're potentially going to think that's the best tool in the universe and the only tool in the universe, and understanding that there's times when that's not the appropriate tool. So a big part of the courses that I teach and the rants that I go on to whoever will listen is when the technique doesn't work, when is it not applicable, and understanding those lines of when we hit the edge of application of any of these techniques is really important. We've seen some new developments of other techniques come along, and understanding how they relate to each other, that's really important. Certainly one, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the modern generation where we've gone from laser ablation ICP-MS in its truest form is, of course, a lab-based tool. You need a laser ablation system. You need a good laser ablation system, and there's nuance into what lasers work with what types of minerals, and we've seen a lot of development improvements of different laser types. The LIBS community, the laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy community, can actually learn a lot from the things the laser ablation community, the laser ablation ICP-MS community, has done wrong over the years. And so we know that certain lasers don't work with certain minerals. It just doesn't literally ablate, and yet we still ignore that fact and put a tiny laser in a handheld device and assume it's going to ablate quartz fine, and that may not be the case. And I won't pick on the handheld number generators. Sometimes I refer to them as the handheld random number generators. I won't pick on them too much because they do really serve a role. But understanding when those numbers are random numbers as opposed to proper numbers, understanding when the technique breaks down is really important. I think the communities have a lot to learn. The instrument vendors, instrument types have a lot to learn from the different techniques. And for years, we've tried to ablate different minerals in the lab setting with different laser types. And sometimes it just doesn't work that well. And so understanding that your LIBS Pew handheld device might not actually be ablating all the minerals in your rock appropriately, that's already been demonstrated by the lab-based laser ablation community. So there's still a lot to learn in, even it's not all solved. Certainly where we are today is better than in 24 years ago now when I started this laser ablation stuff. And I think that's, I guess it was 1999, so 25 years when I started this laser ablation stuff. We understand the interaction of minerals and lasers a whole lot better, thanks to some physicists that collaborated with some geologists and some chemists. And that's an important theme here. We actually need to pay attention to those other fields. But I think that the handheld devices, the new technology, anytime we have new technology, there's an opportunity to apply our skills as problem solvers, as detectives, as historians. I think the history of where these instruments have come from is a really important component. Not everybody needs to know all the nuances of all the history of all the ICPs and lasers, but there's some history there that we forget about. Maybe a technique didn't work at a certain time 20 years ago because we just didn't have the right tools at the right time. And if we go back to the history, if we actually read the literature, we can actually uncover that there's a paper from the late 90s that might be telling us something that's applicable to our handheld LIBS device. And so there's a lot of information out there. Really takes a lot of conversations between people that have different backgrounds. Maybe it's through a scientific forum, or maybe it's just at the bar where we're drawing things on a napkin and brainstorming about how things don't work. If we were more open about when the instruments fail. I think this journal of null results that doesn't exist, people are afraid to publish stuff that, hey, I'm going to tell you all the things that went wrong. That sounds really bad from a trying to get funding standpoint. But we tend not to share those stories in the proper literature. I think, Sam, your forum here is really good for presenting things that maybe aren't going to get published in a journal. Talking about things, hey, I saw this weird thing and it didn't work. And then you tell that to another colleague from a different field or a different instrument type, and they're like, yeah, we saw the same thing, but when we stood this way, it actually changed the way it worked, or I tried some wacky thing, and that actually is telling us something about how the technique can be improved. And I think communication of these observations, we're still lacking a forum for sharing wacky ideas or unpublishable ideas, or just sharing things that went wrong. And we don't do enough of that in all the scientific communities. But yeah, about laser ablation, like maybe I'm supposed to talk about microanalysis instead of just rant about scientific philosophy.
I've been enjoying it, and you're not wrong. There is no good forum for really presenting things that go wrong. Like, you get sometimes when people have an abstract that they're presenting at a conference, sometimes they'll make a little note that, oh, this didn't work, but there's always the upside, right? So because they get accepted a lot of times into having a speaking thing, like, you need to have that upside. So it's, yeah, no, I agree. That's part of why we're here.
I think things will get mentioned in a talk, but because still many talks are not available online. We miss that little nugget of they're going to make a comment about something that didn't work. They're not going to publish it. They're not going to put it in the abstract because that's scary.
I agree. One thing I find really frustrating, and look, I know that you pay to go to a conference. I've definitely paid my fair share, but the fact that you have to pay $35 to read an article, the fact that you have to, that you can't ever see something that happened at a conference, that's another, like, you have forums like GeoHug now, like that one is another beautiful platform where people can share these kinds of things, and it's available to everybody. So it's just the lack of free science I find infuriating, and I find it wrong because the people that are making money on this, I just find it to be disproportionate to the people that need to hear this.
Absolutely. And yeah, totally in
another
agreement.
soapbox.
Yes, I know, and I think I'm glad you mentioned GeoHug, and one of your guests on here, Pim's talks here about assay and analytical stuff, incredibly valuable, and him getting that out in other forums. These are really important contributions to the community as a whole, and we don't get any credit for it because we're doing it often in our free time. It's not something that necessarily goes on our CV if people are caring about that. It's not a publication. It's not getting citations. And I think we just value things incorrectly because citation index is a farce, and actual contribution to society and community is measured by doing stuff like this, giving back to the community and talking about the reality of how to make things better.
2 tea times. I love it.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, so about this laser stuff, shoot rocks with lasers, sample the dust that comes out, throw it into an ICP. This is really nowadays it's accepted as commonplace. We see so much economic geology that is looking at economic minerals for maybe we're actually looking at economic value department within some of these minerals. Laser ablation has certainly been adopted, been accepted, and is incredibly useful in this area. I think the vectoring and the exploration side of laser ablation is a really important one because we've been ignoring the trace element story in some of these near deposit minerals up until laser ablation came along. And this is not new. This is for almost as long as I've been doing this. People have recognized that laser ablation plays a role here. We actually have an interesting connection to some of the things I've talked about already with large data sets of laser ablation of certain minerals. I think the community recently has realized that maybe some of the early laser ablation data was actually confounded by we were integrating the whole signal. We're lasering this chlorite mineral and we're assuming it's all chlorite. And if you look down in the weeds, you see these little bumps of little blips of this or that. I actually would spend hours and hours diving into the raw data, the time resolved signal of every analysis. And some of my garnet maps would take me weeks to process the data because I was interested in the garnet signature, not the rock signature, the garnet plus the monazites and the apatites and all the other things hanging out in the garnet. And so we've seen now data sets actually be able to be reprocessed with this knowledge of, oh, all minerals are rocks at some scale, and these little micro inclusions may be buggering up our signal, maybe actually contributing a story. If it's not synchronous, it may be messing up the story, but it also may be telling us a story. The presence and
Yeah.
absence of these micro inclusions, really, that's something that actually needs to be resolved. And laser ablation data up until recently was being ignored for that extra information. We're just focused on what it can do for giving me the trace element content of this apatite or this chloride or this pyrite. But we're throwing away the non-integrated signal, or we were integrating the whole thing incorrectly. And so there's a story there if you look deep enough. And this really is the theme when we go from the bulk, whatever the bulk scale is. The bulk could be the entire origin or just this hand sample. When we go to smaller and smaller scales, we're able to see the story repeats itself where the microanalytical, the micro sampling is telling us something, and we need to unravel those different scales. And with these big data sets that we see coming along, we can actually start to actually see little sub stories of the data come out from those trends. We might see populations in these big data sets that we have no idea what's causing them. And I think the microanalytical work may actually help us resolve some of those, explain some of those differences in the data set. And I think that's really important. Presence and absence of inclusions is a huge area. And if we go back to the old school, actually, where we actually used to look at rocks and thin sections and things on the SEM, you actually see these things there. But I would argue with customers coming into the lab, if they hadn't looked at their samples, I would chase them out. And I think that context is so important. I would argue with them. I would tell them they have inclusions of this or that. It's a titanium phase or a zirconium phase in their samples. And they would say, oh, no, it's not there because they looked at a thin section for 5 seconds and they thought that was sufficient. And if they looked at a thin section at all, because who does that these days?
Yeah, no, I've definitely heard of some micro inclusion work being done, but also it's like another thing that really won't be available probably to the public for another 5 years.
Yeah,
So
it's And you touched on a really important point. When does this academic research actually become useful? If it's not actually helping the bottom line, industry isn't going to really care about it. If it's just an academic pursuit, then okay, great, it makes a nice paper, but nobody cares about it. But when it becomes impactful, when we can actually make it reliable, accessible. There's hundreds of laser ablation labs around the world that all could be contributing to this. And I think that we maybe oversold laser ablation instruments over the past 20 years. The vendors would hate me for saying that, but we would sell them to anybody who had some money, and that's fine. That's how the business works. But many of them didn't really know how to fully use them, and that's why we don't have as many labs that are contributing to the industry, because the lab is still figuring out how to use the instrument as opposed to actually using it appropriately and being available as a resource for us, say, here in industry. Yeah, microanalytical is the sum of the parts, and I live in this world now where the bulk stuff actually is what we care about, because what are the payable elements in the dump truck, in the haul truck, and I talk about that sum of the parts. The irony here is I'm now responsible for the assay labs, helping out globally with technical methods development for Newmont, and I've spent most of my career actually avoiding dissolving rocks by lasering them, because that's oftentimes easier. But the interesting connection is I work closely with the bulk chem lab at the USGS. And one of the things that we did, which is novel, is we actually looked at our samples. We actually looked at our digestion tubes. And when things weren't making sense geochemically, we would actually look at the residue in the bottom of the digestion tube. We bring it over to the laser and analyze what isn't dissolving. And we would use the laser to troubleshoot the bulk chemistry. And here I go on a rant, on a soapbox. The mineralogy is important. We throw the powder into the tube, assuming that it will all behave consistently with whatever acid cocktail we think is appropriate, and we also assume that it fully dissolves. We talk about total digestions. I would argue that many of the things, and we've seen a transition from the 4-acid digestion being referred to as a total digestion to near total, or not always total. We've seen the brochures actually say, hey, don't forget that the 4-acid digestion doesn't always dissolve everything, yet we interpret it sometimes as if it had. And so on these whole rock mineral trends, deciphering mineralogy by bulk chemistry, rather than actually doing the mineralogy, we try to back build the mineralogy from the bulk chemistry. And that's great if everything behaves appropriately. One way to
people
actually
would be mad at me for this, but and look, like, you're not going to get everything from any kind of mineralogy technique as well, because they all have their limitations, as we say about geochemistry. But I was recently comparing a 4-acid to a tear spec interpretation, and that was striking.
Yes.
In the disagreement between just a general alteration mineralogy trend diagram with the mineralogy that you were actually seeing, and it was alarming. And I was like, I don't even think we can compare this. It's just, I don't think I can. I think it's this interesting place that I'm at right now, where I love to integrate these mineralogy data sets with the geochemistry, but it's also just recognizing, actually, I would rather use mineralogy for this part, and I would rather use geochemistry for this part, because this is its strength and this is that strength. And sometimes I feel at this point that combining them actually isn't going to do any good. In this, on a one-to-one setting, where you can just be like, oh, because I have this, therefore this, and these data sets are completely talking together. They do generally talk to each other, but they don't fully talk to each other. And I've been very upset and frustrated by it. But also, you just have to realize, as you say, these limitations of digestions and finishes.
Yeah, and of course there are many times where it works. That's why we say we can use it. But
we also only publish the ones where it's worked, and the amount that I've seen where it's worked, it just led me to this false sense of security. And now, more often than not, I'm just seeing all these examples of where it isn't working, and I'm just very upset by it.
Yeah, and that's because you and I are misled by reading that publication that makes it look like wonderful correlation. They're
Mhm.
not telling you that they have all these other data sets that suck. And there's a reason, there's a mineralogical reason when they deviate, and I think that's the important point. I think that most people think that the analytical lab is mineralogy agnostic. We're just going to throw the powder in a tube and we're not going to think about the mineralogy. And I'm constantly answering questions when people have trouble in the analytical lab. I'm answering their question by asking more questions, telling them to go bug the mineralogy group and figure out what was in their sample before they just threw rocks at the analytical lab. And if you knew that you had unobtainium in your sample from the mineralogy, you might actually pick a different assay, pick a different digestion. And so those are really important points. When we talk about alteration minerals, we're talking about fine grain, crappy stuff, intergrown, dog's breakfast of different
Intergrowth is
minerals.
the
Yeah.
super key part of that. So key.
Yes. And so how do you unravel that? If you throw zero 0.2 grams in a beaker and assume that the acid is dissolving everything, okay, that's one flaw. If you assume that the TerraSpec is always right, that's also a potential flaw with the intergrown stuff. So yeah, that's one of the challenges. Mineralogy is important, mineralogy is important, mineralogy is important. And I think that we're seeing the community swing around a little bit back towards maybe respecting some mineralogy, geometallurgy, or body knowledge or deposit knowledge. All of these terms really have an implied component that maybe we should understand our stuff before we put it in the mill.
Totally. Look, we've been talking about so many things, but I think really what's important right now is a question that I have, which is
Yes.
what is your most favorite and hated microanalytical techniques and why?
Yeah. This
I
is like
just feel
saying like
we got
which
to get the
kid is
drama. Yeah.
yeah, which between my two kids, which one is my favorite? It's a tough one. I have a love-hate relationship. Obviously, laser ablation is where I've spent most of my career, but I'm actually going to go ahead and surprise a bunch of my colleagues and say, as much as I hate libs, I also think libs is powerful. So I'm going to answer your question with my most favorite and my most hated technique is actually laser induced breakdown spectroscopy. And this is because it has so much potential. It's so misunderstood. It's so oversimplified. These are intergrown potential and oversimplified. Are intergrown, both advantages and challenges. Libs can do things that laser ablation can't. It can do fluorine. I have had a whole series of slides when I was working for the last vendor, which also made libs equipment, a whole series of slides. What the F? Because we overlook fluorine. Because the ICP-MS, the ICP can't do fluorine, we've actually stopped thinking about fluorine. And fluorine's important. It's like
Super for Met.
yes, exactly. Or with all the craze about rare earths, fluorine is the sulfur is the gold, fluorine is to rare earths in terms of mobility. But we can't do fluorine by laser ablation ICP-MS, so we're not going to actually talk about the fluorine. If you actually look at reference materials certificates over time, fluorine actually stopped getting added to certificates for bulk analysis for bulk powder reference materials because the ICP, the lab didn't do fluorine, and I got to pay extra if I want fluorine. So screw it, I just won't
It's
put it on the certificate.
expensive though. Yeah.
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 And I think that these extra elements that we can do by libs, that's an area that actually is really got a lot of potential. So I'm dodging the question by not picking a favorite because I'm saying I love it and I hate it.
But I like that. That's
Okay,
cool.
that's
So how do
cool.
you feel
Yeah.
about bulk?
Yeah, so bulk, this is where the money is. We have to do the bulk chemistry. I think that there's a lot of problems with these assumptions of digestion, and I think that we actually overlook some of the direct solid sampling tools. There's techniques that have gotten forgotten about that actually used to zap the solid in bulk scale. The arc spark instruments of days of old. The USGS had a mobile lab that would actually go out in the field. This is going back to the 70s and actually throw the powder under a big spark and make spark emission measurements in the field. They would, in the early days, they would develop photoplates and give you a rapid bulk analysis of what was in your rock. It's what we do with the handheld XRF today. And so the bulk sampling is definitely important. We've talked about the nugget effect. And if we're actually trying to give you an average chemistry, we need to average all those nuggets. So I think we're sampling too small of samples today. We, of course, with fire assay, we know that we're going to go from, instead of 0.2 grams, we're going to go 30, 50 grams. Maybe that's not even enough. I would say that I'm going to totally cheat here, and I'm going to pick the love and hate. I have a love-hate relationship with fire assay because everybody assumes fire assay is the gold standard, and for many reasons it is. But if we do one 50-gram charge of fire assay and we get one number, the assumption is that's representative of the whole block or the whole bench. I think in many cases we're not sampling enough. We're assuming that's representative. Even when we do screen fire, we're seeing nuggety analyses, and fire assay sometimes gets oversimplified, over abused in thinking that a couple analyses are enough. And this is where we have maybe other techniques coming online where we can analyze 500 grams at a time instead of 50 grams. I think this is really shedding some light on, oh, wait, maybe my one fire assay analysis wasn't enough. The beauty of fire assay and its 1,000-year-old techniques is there's really some cool chemistry going on there. But in today's day and age, fire assay is an art, and we're losing some of the great artists, some of the fire assayers that can listen to the rock, smell the rock, and adjust the recipe for fire assay, adjust the flux recipe for fire assay depending on the chemistry. We've lost a lot of that, and because of the better, faster, cheaper, or just faster and cheaper, we see the contract labs oversimplifying fire assay and in some cases screwing it up. So I think that I'll answer that question also with both love and hate.
I like that though. Returning a little bit back to microanalytical techniques, you have this really cool graphic in your workshop that shows detection limit in ppb versus atomic number, showing a range of instrumentation, is entitled Why Laser Ablation. So since you made that slide in 2016, is laser ablation still king, or has it been replaced by another technique?
Yeah, king. It depends on the question.
King or queen?
Yes. Absolutely. I think I always answer the question with it depends. If
Mm.
PPB is what you're looking for and PPB is what you really need. Now, I argue with many of our colleagues and customers here. Oh, the detection limits weren't good enough. Yeah, but you have no idea what PPB levels of unobtainium actually mean. So the OES data that you got that only has ppm detection limits is good enough for your question. Let's go back to what the actual question actually is, and then we'll talk about the appropriate technique. So I think that's just a little bit about what was the question. What's the scale? We're seeing some really fun stuff right now because people are running around with the handheld libs, realizing that it's sampling only a teeny tiny area, and I'm going to shoot a couple times on the outcrop. And if it's giant pegmatite, we're looking at a 3-meter long spodumene, and I'm analyzing a 50 micron spot. How representative of that entire spodumene is that 150 micron analysis? And so we're seeing this realization that, oh, wait, sometimes smaller isn't better. And so, yeah, there's many dimensions to this question. In terms of detection limits, laser ablation with an ICP-MS is certainly still the most sensitive microanalytical tool routinely available today. And I think yes, it still is the premier trace element microprobe. Everybody's forgotten about electron microprobes because they're not as new and sexy as laser ablation
They're
systems.
hard to use.
And they're expensive. And so the laser ablation system actually gets used in the place of where an electron microprobe maybe was used in the past. And there still are applications where the microprobe is useful. I would argue that an SEM analysis, looking at your samples, hopefully maybe you've looked at a thin section too, but whatever, an SEM analysis and a laser ablation analysis, those are the minimum requirements. But then we've got this whole other area of scale, macro laser ablation. Should we just take the rock and powder it and shoot it with a large beam system where we average a lot of things. Should we try to get trace element analyses from a fused disk using laser ablation? This is an area that has been tried and still has some problems, but certainly can be worked out. And actually, laser ablation could have a role in that. There's some new techniques coming along, and I can't say enough for those that are actually sticking their neck out and actually trying to develop something new to challenge something like fire assay or laser ablation, ICP-MS. And so we've seen some non-ICP related techniques. There's a new technique called laser ablation, laser ionization, which is actually just taking your sample, lasering in a vacuum, and then sucking the ions into a mass spectrometer. So you get rid of that ICP. And the ICP is great. Everybody loves an ICP, but the ICP is part of the problem for matrix effects. We're having to ionize our sample in this plasma, and behavior or misbehavior in the plasma. I talk about plasma misbehavior all the time, and that's really the source of our matrix effects. So if we could build a better plasma or get rid of the plasma entirely, maybe we'll actually see some development in some of these other areas.
Interesting. So then building on that, what would you think that our biggest myth or misconception, or both really, that we have in analytical geochemistry is?
Yeah, another tough one to narrow down. Biggest myth or series of myths: trusting the numbers. Just because a system generates a number doesn't mean the number is right, doesn't mean the number is appropriate for the question that is or isn't asked. And certainly we're assuming that the technique is correct. Good labs are required by various accreditations and just moral responsibilities to do their best to make sure the numbers they're generating are correct. Oftentimes, it's actually not the labs that are actually at fault. I often talk about how it's easy to blame the instrument, and when it's really the sample preparation or even the sampling. If we're talking metallurgical samples, how is that sampler actually running? Is the sampler working properly to give us a representative sample? If we don't get the right answer according to some metallurgical balance or just some logic or some exploration geochemistry, if we don't get the right answer, is it the instrument's fault or is it the sampling's fault? Is it contaminated? Did the grinder, the crusher get not cleaned properly? Again, it's easy to talk about the most complex part of the equation, and that's the instrument, but oftentimes the easiest explanation is the simplest parts weren't cleaned or weren't run properly or weren't sampled properly. Oh yeah, we just grabbed a scoop off the top of the envelope and assumed that was representative of the sample. Poop in, poop out applies here at the instrument level. Just because it's a number doesn't mean it's the appropriate number. Sometimes that has to do with the instrument. A lot of times it has to do with the whole equation, which includes the sample prep.
Yeah, and I guess also still building on that, my next question is really, why do you believe that some labs are so poor at respecting relatively routine techniques and ultimately do very poor basic geochemistry?
The easy answer is money. Time is money. And we've seen labs really speed up their process. If you give me a finely powdered sample, maybe I can speed up the digestion. We've seen some of the contract labs over the years change their incoming particle size. It has to be ground finer than a certain particle size distribution. That helps them on speed. And if they can run the digestion 5 minutes instead of 30 minutes, maybe that's great because time is money. Is that 5-minute digestion actually working the same as the 30-minute digestion? That's open for question. When we do the validation, we do it with behaved reference materials. The assumption that the QC materials behave or misbehave equally to your unknowns, that's where we really run into problem. We don't know the answer for the unknown samples. So it's not the lab's fault if the QCs come back fine and your unknowns are weird and don't match. But matrix matched reference materials for your deposits, for your samples, those really are important. We don't have enough good reference materials to cover all the wacky matrices that we have out there. So I think that we cheat. We try to save money as the customer, but we don't submit enough QCs, and so it's not the lab's fault if we don't have our own QC program to monitor the labs as well.
And the other thing I was thinking about in this term too, and we talk about just companies trying to cheat a little bit and not spend money on QC, but companies sometimes also get bogged down by their accounting departments. I guess really just how do we as geochemists best steer our companies away from making these poor decisions and going solely with labs on price point?
Yeah, I ask the question often: do you want the fast answer, the correct answer, or the cheap answer? Of course, they always want it fast, cheap, and correct, and you can't get all three at the same time. What are we really trying to do? If it's a large survey, we have to do thousands of samples. If we have enough data, we can actually start to see trends through some of the incorrectness, and I think that it'll still point in the correct direction if it's not the appropriate method. We'll pick the aqua regia digest because it's cheaper. It's cheaper than the whole rock fusion combined with a 4-acid or some other fusion technique, the appropriate total digestion. If aqua regia is actually dissolving all the minerals that you care about, it's going to be cheaper. Then that's the appropriate answer to go ahead and work with. But I think if it's a new program, asking those questions about what are we up against, what sort of wacky minerals do we have in our rocks, that would actually decide. At the beginning of a program, if you actually compare a couple techniques against each other, I know that gives you 3 different answers if you have 3 different methods, and people hate that, but that could actually design the rest of your program. Yes, maybe aqua regia is fine, but it'll give me bad results because this particular element is locked up in a phase that I didn't think it was. There's examples of really fun things like thallium being actually high in the biotite, and the biotite's not going to dissolve in the aqua regia. So you're going to get the wrong answer for thallium. If thallium is one of your vector elements, you're screwed if you're using aqua regia. But if you assume that the thallium's all tied up in the sulfides, which is a common assumption, and I've got really cool laser ablation data from some biotites where the thallium content of these biotites near the ore zone is off the charts, and people don't know about, oh wait, biotite could potentially have thallium in it. That's actually going to bugger with your results if you're doing a partial versus a total digestion.
Hmm, interesting. So in your email, you mentioned that we as geologists stuck in the past with our 1,000-year-old techniques like fire assay, but are relatively quick also to adopt new widgets. And I think we talked quite a bit about it, but I just want to throw it out there. What is your unadulterated opinion on technique adoption in geochemistry, especially now working for a mining company?
Yeah, it's an interesting balance because as exploration geologists, we always want the new technique that's going to help us find gold out in the field. And so we are quick to adopt some of the field-based techniques, and then we sometimes maybe prematurely adopt those and bring it back to the lab, and it doesn't fully pan out. But we're also incredibly stubborn as a community, so we're a little schizophrenic in that regard. With back in the lab, especially when it comes to metallurgy and metallurgical accounting, we're gonna trust fire assay because that's what we've been doing for 1,000 years, and we're going to be resistant to adopting. We've seen a great influx of gamma activation analysis, or photon assay as the brand name is called, and we've seen, I think, a little bit of a resistance to it. Some of the companies have adopted it more earlier, but some companies are resistant to it just because it's change, and we're back to the human component. Oh, I don't want to change because I'm comfortable with my 1,000 years of fire assay data. But I think that we need to be open to those new techniques, but at the same time, we need to validate, and make sure that they're going to work for us in all situations. We run a couple QCs, and it works out for the easy samples, and then we buy a $1 million instrument, and then we run it on our real samples, and things don't add up. So there's reason for caution, certainly, but I think that we should be a little more adept as a community for innovation and adopting new technology when appropriate.
Yeah, hear that. My final question here is just what's your favorite part about being part of the analytical geochemistry world? And is there a demand for new people to enter this line of work?
Absolutely. On the new people, we need new perspectives. We need new bodies. We need people to help us crush rocks, and go beyond that as well.
To
But
learn as they crush.
exactly, and respect the sample prep. But yeah, I think the interdisciplinary nature, just my background of chemist. I always say I wear 2 hats. I have to switch between the chemist hat and the geologist hat. Now, actually, here at the mining company, working in technical services and mineral processing, the metallurgical side of things is really important. I love that interdisciplinary conversations. They don't happen enough because we tend to migrate back to our comfort zone or our own silos. But being at that nexus of these disciplines, the mineralogy, the metallurgy, the environmental side, which of course is very important. And I think that's probably my favorite part of this is I get to contribute across multiple discipline boundaries. And that's really super fun. I think that in terms of the needing people, this is really an area where you can actually start out in one area, specialize, and move to another area. We've certainly had a lot of folks start out in the assay lab as chemists and realize that they love mineralogy and go off and do mineralogy and expand their skills and expand their career options by changing from one area, from say the assay lab to mineralogy, or falling in love with metallurgy. And really that's what drives the business. And so there's lots of opportunity by starting out in this area that's in the middle of overlapping Venn diagrams, and then you can specialize in one of the neighboring Venn diagrams down the road.
So interesting. I just really want to thank you so much for being here. And I really hope that you enjoyed being on the show. Really, honestly, we're allowed to rant to your heart's content. I even took out our one of our questions because I felt like we went through those rants a few times over, which I was all in for.
Right on. Yeah, no, this has been great. People know that I can get long-winded and talk on a whole series of rabbit holes. But I think that it's important for the community out there to know that there's all these weird connections, and I think a platform like this does a good job at making people aware of some of the fun stuff that we get to do.
Totally. I would not have thought of a position like yours being as like a kind of not an end game, but like a place to work towards or something. And I think that's really important for all of our geochemists out there to know that if they love analytical geochem, here you go.
Absolutely. And as an analytical geochemist, you may end up getting a job in a research hospital working on prostate tissue, prostate cancer research, or
Mhm.
any of a variety of options. The sky's the limit.
Love that. I want to thank everybody for listening to Geochemistry, and a big thanks to Alan Koenig for being on the show, dishing his tea, rants, and everything all about these analytical techniques. I also want to thank our sponsor, LKI Consulting, and to It's Water and Coma Media for our music. And I'm looking forward to chatting with everybody next month.
Awesome.